Well, thank you very much for asking me to come and share some thoughts with you. And in my own imagination, I thought there might be 5 or 6 people, you see, so I'm not geared for so many, although even in my classes, I don't have this many people. But, the images that I want to deal with from the book of Genesis are the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden and the dispersion of the peoples at Babel. And my question is, are these two events a punishment from God or a blessing? Now that might strike you as very odd because there are not too many people who would even suggest that the expulsion was a blessing, and neither the dispersion that it was a blessing. But I want to preface the presentation of those two events in the book of Genesis with a personal interest. I have found it very curious in my own life and in many others that when something bad or negative happens to us, that we fail or something, we have a sickness or we find our life not progressing, that somehow we tend to blame ourselves, that we have done something wrong. Why did I get cancer? Why am I a slow learner? We can blame ourselves, or we blame others. And finally, if we can't blame ourselves or blame others, we'll blame, guess who? God. And so the reason I find that strange that we have this gut reaction of blaming ourselves or others or God is that when you think of it, have you ever grown or been transformed without struggle or without pain? It strikes me, even from a simple observation of life in the vegetative world, the animal world, our own human development, and certainly even our psychological and spiritual development, that there is no growth without some sort of stress. And so, I ask myself this question: why do we not also understand the struggles, the pain, even failures, as blessings, perhaps blessings in disguise? So, with that question in mind, I would like to explore these two parts of Scripture that normally the history of tradition has interpreted as punishment. Okay? The expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and then the dispersion. The really important one for me is the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So I'm going to refresh our memories, okay? Of course, I would love to ask people right now, although that would probably break the course of events here, on what you think, with a show of hands, how many think it's a blessing and how many think it's a curse. But we won't do that. Maybe we can do that later. Well, after the eating from the forbidden fruit, you know what happens, that Adam and Eve, remember there was the threat of death? If you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will, mot tamut is the Hebrew, it's very emphatic, you will die the death. Of course, which death, you don't know. So they did, as you know, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But notice what happened to them. Do you remember the very first thing that happened? They were afraid. And what they did was they covered their nakedness with clothing made of leaves. And they hid. You know the story. Well, at the end of all of that dialogue between God and the woman, the man, and the serpent, there was one thing that God did. God gave them clothing of skins and then threw them out of the garden. So I'm going to read that section very briefly here. Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." And there's a blank. In fact, another translation would be, "Lest he reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat." And there's a blank. "Therefore, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life." I know it sounds like a punishment. He drove him out. Doesn't want him ever to have access to the garden. Okay. Now notice the very next event. Now, the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." Next, she bore his brother Abel. Okay, so let's now ask ourselves this question. What is the significance of Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden? I know that it seems as if it's a punishment. They disobeyed God. They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were aware of their nakedness, whatever that means. I think it means much more than simply not having clothes. But they become aware of their nakedness, their fragility, their need to grow, perhaps even that. And they are thrown out of the garden. But notice this, that if it were a punishment, it seems very strange that the very first act that Adam and Eve do when they are outside of the garden is they make love. This phrase, "the man knew his wife," knowing means that he has an intimate knowledge of his wife. They had intercourse. They had sexual relations. They made love to one another. And the result of that is that they have given birth to a son, and his name was Cain. And shortly afterward, the story goes very rapidly forward, and also Abel is born. So just consider this. What appears to be a punishment, and I grant that it appears to be so, something terrible happens. They are thrown out of the garden. But let's go, if we can, into the imagination of God. I know we have very few indications from the text, but let's go into the imagination of God. Why is God barring them from the garden? You remember? Lest they take from the tree of life and live forever. But you see, if they are going to live forever in the garden where they have not known each other, then perhaps that is going to be a terrible thing. So let's consider it this way. Remember, the very first command to humans in Genesis 1, when they were created, "Let us make humans in our own image, something like us." And so God created them, male and female. And he gave them the command, which is really a blessing, "Be fruitful and spread through the world." Be fruitful and spread through the world. So really this fruitfulness is really the blessing that Adam and Eve, that humans are given. So when you consider that in the garden they were not fruitful. Now, however you interpret the significance of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you know there's a whole plethora of interpretations as to what that could possibly mean. What even does the significance of the tree of life in the garden mean? Those are highly symbolic images. But what we do know from the brevity of the text is that they were in the garden and they were not participating in the blessing. So is it possible that the expulsion from the garden is not simply an expulsion, it is a propulsion. It is sending them forth precisely to create a new situation where in fact they can know each other and make love and be fruitful. Well, I certainly think that the image of leaving the garden can be akin to any moment of growth where you leave one level of being that you're familiar with in order to reach out to another form of life. You know the old saying, one door closes and another opens. So certainly I think that the expulsion from the garden, at least with the brevity of the text that we have, would suggest that God is not punishing Adam and Eve, but rather is trying to reconstruct a situation for humanity, according to the book of Genesis, where they have another chance of life. And if you read the book of Genesis from beginning to end, you'll see that this happens over and over again. That God is always the one who is trying to recreate a situation where in fact the possibility for human life, for fruitfulness, for blessing, for companionship, for community is made possible from beginning to end. So let's take the second one now, and that is the Tower of Babel. This is at the end of the primeval account. These two stories, by the way, go very much hand in hand. The story of the expulsion from the garden and then what I would call the dispersion at Babel. Again, it seems as if God is punishing. It seems. So let's just look at the text again. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered upon the face of the whole earth." Do you remember the first blessing? To be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Lest we are scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Again, I grant you that it appears to be a punishment. But if you come back to the original blessing in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, then we can see that at this point they have been fruitful, they have participated in fruitfulness. But notice the insistence on the oneness, and this insistence on oneness could be that they are not, in fact, spreading. They are not, in fact, becoming plural so that they can achieve a unity that is really forged. And so again, this dispersion does not have to be conceived of as a punishment. It can be again God trying to recreate a situation whereby humans are going to participate in the blessing that God had intended in the beginning, to become multiple. And yes, there can be a value of the oneness, but not a oneness that does not respect the plurality of so many. So, what is the result of the dispersion? The result of the dispersion is that they spread. They spread. And finally, God then, at the end of chapter 11, chooses one family through which to recreate the image of humans in a covenantal text. And then we have, of course, the story of Abraham and his family right to the end of the book that leads us right into Exodus. So, if I just come back now and notice, in fact, it was one of my students who suggested this to me, that it's interesting that the tree of life motif for the expulsion from the garden, that really treats the issue of time. Remember, the tree of life is meant to give them immortality. But the danger of that immortality, according to my reading of the text, is that they would be solidified in their unfruitfulness. But the issue there is time. Whereas the dispersion deals with space. So we have both time and space being presented as the moments or events where God intervenes to recreate a situation where in fact humans will have a chance again at the blessings of life, the blessings of fruitfulness, and the blessings of plurality and multiplicity. Not as a negative, but as a multiplicity that then gives humans a chance at forging a unity. Not a unity that is imposed, one people, one language, but a unity that is achieved. So from there, I would like to draw some attention to other situations in Genesis where we see that humans who appear to be rejected, humans who appear to have failed, that there again we notice God's interventions to give them life. And I think, again, this may shock you, but take the case of the first murder, Cain. Remember Cain, we do not know why, but his offering was not accepted by God. He's jealous, he's envious of his younger brother Abel. He takes him into the field, and he strikes and he kills him. And remember what God says, very similar to what God had said in the garden to Adam. Where are you? Here it's, where is your brother? In the garden it was to Adam, where are you? Because God knew that something has gone wrong. And so with Cain he says, where is your brother? And the famous retort, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. But of course, he didn't say that. Am I my brother's keeper? And you know what happens? He's punished. Yes, he is punished. But what I want to point out is the limit of the punishment. In fact, God protects Cain with a mark. And so you notice that even this one who has done something seriously wrong, I'm sure that there would have been cries of capital punishment. You've killed your brother, you should be killed. And interestingly, in the book of Genesis, Cain is protected by God, and in fact goes on to become one who founds a city. And so civilization, in a sense, begins with Cain, a person who sinned, who created a murder, and yet this person, with God's intervention, again becomes a person who contributes to the whole process of life. So he's protected. I think it's important to notice that. He was not condemned with capital punishment. He was protected by God. Then if you keep on going through the events, I know that the flood narrative, certainly you would say that, well, the flood narrative is God's punishment for all the wickedness and evil that has been accumulated in humanity. And it's true. If you ever just simply sit and read the text, you can be somewhat horrified. God there in the flood narrative is quite angry and destroys, sends the rain 40 days and 40 nights, and all flesh is eliminated. But it's interesting even here that what does the story focus on? In fact, it doesn't focus on the destruction. It focuses on God through this destruction trying to bring about the occasion of new life with the whole story of Noah. So notice you do have destruction, but the point of the narrative is that God is trying to recreate the situation on the earth to bring about a new creation. Then let me just go through some of the characters that we'll encounter later. I think the most significant one is Hagar and her son Ishmael. So you know Abraham and Sarah are promised a son. They are promised that the covenantal relationship will continue through Abraham and through Sarah. Not just Abraham, but through Abraham and Sarah. And you know what happens? Again, we tend to foil things up. Both Abraham and Sarah are afraid that they are not going to have a son. And you know what happens? Sarah gives her servant, Hagar, to Abraham so that they could have a son through Abraham. And that's what happens. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. But both Hagar and Ishmael are rejected. Remember, Sarah becomes very upset with Hagar, who apparently lorded it over her, that in fact she was able to bear a son and not Sarah. And then later on, when finally Sarah does have a son, Isaac, she doesn't want them to play together. And so she forces Abraham to expel. We have another expulsion. This time, Ishmael and Hagar are expelled. And hopefully you know the background of this story, that in fact God intervenes when Hagar leaves. Remember, and says, "Why are you crying, woman?" And then also when Abraham does expel Ishmael and Hagar and forges a covenant with Abraham, Abraham says, "Well, what about Ishmael?" Abraham is concerned about his eldest son. And the same blessing that occurs with Sarah occurs with Hagar and Ishmael. I always found it a great touch with the burial of Abraham. It's a very gentle little comment, but when Abraham finally dies, who buries him? Do you know? It's Ishmael and Isaac. He had many other children. Hope you know that as well. But the two who bury him, the two who count the most, Ishmael because he was the firstborn, and Isaac because the covenant was promised through his line because of Sarah and Abraham. And so the two of them are the ones who bury Abraham. Then another situation where again we see someone who you could say is wronged or through his own difficulty lost the birthright. It's Esau. So Esau and Jacob. You know the story here, hopefully. But again, the text is very interesting how it describes the relationship between Esau and his brother Jacob. It's a longer narrative, it's quite long, but there are two stories given for how Jacob, in fact, is the one who receives his father's blessing. One is that Jacob tricks him, and the other is that Esau sells his birthright for some food. And so, what happens is again, the elder son is not going to be the one who carries the promise. And so even here I ask myself the question, well, how does God, in the narrative, treat the one who is not chosen? Jacob is the one who's chosen. He's going to be the one who carries forth the blessing. And how is Esau treated? He is also blessed. He also has a great family. And yes, he's going to live alongside Jacob. And so later, the families of Esau will become relatives to the family of Jacob when they return to Canaan. And then if we just take the last one, and that is the story of Joseph in the last part of Genesis. Now here it perhaps is a little more obvious, but Joseph is the favored one of Jacob, Israel. He's the favored one. You have 12 sons. Well, at this point, when he's favored, there are only 11, because Benjamin is still going to be born. But when he's 17, he has these bombastic dreams of being the center of the universe, as any 17-year-old, or maybe even a little older, can have. He has a dream where the 11 sheaves bow down to his sheaf in the field. And so he tells that to his brothers, and as you can imagine, his brothers are furious. Then he has this other dream that he even tells his father, namely that the sun and the moon and the stars bow down to him. You know, I'm the center of the universe. And the father then is concerned, and he reprimands him for that dream. But what happens? He's rejected. He's rejected by his brothers. And again, it's a very long story, but you can ask yourself this question: what is the purpose, in the narrative at least, of that rejection? You could say that he was somewhat at fault for that rejection, namely that he really had such a large image of himself to the point that he thought he was the center of the universe, and didn't really quite understand that any gifts that he has are meant to be for the service of the family, of the community. You could say that. And so then, what is the purpose, if you like, of the rejection of the brothers selling him and him going into Egypt? Well, perhaps it's that he learns. So that you have again a situation where an apparent tragedy, and the story of the betrayal of the brothers of Joseph can be read, as it's their fault, or also that it's partly his fault. It can be read in either of those cases. However, what is the result? What is the result of his having been expelled from his family, being sold into Egypt, and finally working in the household of Potiphar? What is the end result of that? The end result is that he's learned a few things. He's learned that, in fact, what he does, the gifts that he has, namely the ability to interpret dreams, is to be used for others. So remember when he's in prison because of Potiphar's wife, the false accusation, he interprets the dream of the cupbearer. Is it almost time? Of the cupbearer and the butler and the baker. And that story it leads to him interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh. And it's very telling, the very last statement between Joseph and his brothers is this. When finally Jacob dies, and now the brothers are afraid that finally Joseph, who has reached the pinnacle of power in Egypt, will wreak havoc with them. And this is what he tells them. No, the evil that you have done to me has by God's design been turned to good. An incredible statement when you think of it. So perhaps the evil that we perceive of God expelling Adam and Eve from the garden has been turned to good. Perhaps the evil or the punishment that we think is occurring with the dispersion at Babel, in fact, by God's design, is turned to good. And with that, I'll stop.